August 1944. A thin morning mist hangs over makeshift transit camp on the outskirts of Chartres. The gunfire has fallen silent, pushed eastward by the rapid advance of Allied armor. What remains behind is a stillness so deep it feels unfamiliar, an emptiness left by an army that occupied every corner of life for 4 long years. Inside the camp's rusted wire enclosure, a group of French women step hesitantly into the open. Some are barefoot. Others clutch blankets around shoulders rubbed raw by months of confinement. The white flag above the gate, raised hours earlier by retreating German guards, flutters weakly in the breeze. A squad of US GIs approaches with slow, uncertain steps. They did not expect to find prisoners here, much less women. Most are barely older than the prisoners themselves, boys from Ohio, Texas, and California suddenly confronted with the human cost of a continent in chains. One GI lowers his rifle. Another removes his helmet. The women stare silently back, unsure if liberation is real or just another moment of war's confusion. And as the GIs cross the threshold of the camp, the long work of rebuilding broken lives quietly begins. These stories aren't just history, they're proof of human courage and sacrifice. If you too salute these heroes, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and become a part of our journey. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Let's continue the story. The liberation of France in the summer of 1944 is often remembered through the thunder of Allied armor, the sweeping movements of infantry divisions, and the clear strategic aim of breaking German occupation. But beneath those movements existed a quieter, more fragile story, one involving civilians who had been pulled into the machinery of war with almost no warning and even fewer protections. Among them were French women who had been arrested, deported, or forced into service by German authorities for reasons that varied from resistance activity to simple suspicion. By 1943, with the German war effort stretched thin, occupation policy hardened. Women who carried messages for the resistance, who sheltered airmen, or who were merely connected to suspected fighters were seized in raids. Others were detained as political prisoners, caught in the broad net cast by the Gestapo and the Sicherheitsdienst, who feared the spread of underground networks. Some were transferred to French-run prisons under German oversight. Many more were pushed into labor battalions and agricultural work details that fed the German garrison system. The lines between criminal charge, political retaliation, and arbitrary arrest often blurred into a single reality: confinement. Conditions varied sharply from one facility to another. Transit camps, like the one at Vittel, Romanville, or smaller makeshift enclosures near major rail hubs, held women for weeks or months before sending them deeper into the WWII. Others remained in local detention centers meant to support field operations, especially in regions where German units faced strong resistance activity. Food was scarce. Sanitation minimized to essentials. Medical supplies nearly non-existent as German logistics collapsed under Allied bombing. By early 1944, malnutrition and disease were common in nearly every overcrowded holding site west of the Rhine. The situation worsened as the Allied offensive approached. When US forces broke out of Normandy in July and August, the rapid collapse of German positions created a wave of chaotic withdrawals. Frontline units abandoned posts overnight. Guard detachments disappeared into retreating columns. Many camps were left without supervision, doors unlocked, fences unguarded, supplies untouched. In some places, German officers ordered prisoners marched eastward in columns that often fragmented under air attacks or exhaustion. But in others, the German departure was abrupt, leaving prisoners unsure whether to flee, wait, or risk stepping into a war zone they did not understand. For French civilians, the summer of 1944 brought a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Villages heard the distant rumble of artillery long before they saw Allied uniforms. Rumors traveled faster than armies, that Americans were moving swiftly toward the Seine, that German forces were pulling back toward the Vosges, that liberation was close, but danger closer. Tens of thousands of people, including many recently detained women, became displaced, drifting between ruined towns, abandoned outposts, and hastily erected checkpoints. It was in this environment of uncertainty, hunger, and psychological exhaustion that the first large encounters between U.S. troops and liberated French women occurred. The U.S. Army had anticipated civilian displacement in a general sense. Military planners understood that the movement of millions across Western Europe would accompany any major offensive. But the specific reality of encountering female civilian prisoners, some political detainees, some forced laborers, others simply arrested under the occupation's arbitrary rules, was not fully included in pre-invasion models. Most American units entering rural France had only basic instructions for handling prisoners of war, not civilian victims of occupation forces. Their standard training emphasized securing territory, moving supplies, and engaging enemy soldiers. Humanitarian procedures were secondary, handled when time and circumstances allowed. Yet as divisions advanced across the French countryside, the war presented them with a different kind of responsibility. Prisoners stumbled out of abandoned camps with little understanding of what came next. Some tried to walk home across hundreds of kilometers. Others remained near the sites of their captivity, afraid to move without guidance. Local French authorities, still reeling from years of German control and the sudden collapse of the occupation administration, struggled to resume normal duties. Many towns had no functioning police, no municipal services, and no organized system for identifying former detainees or providing food and shelter. This vacuum meant that, for a brief period, the only structured force capable of offering immediate assistance was the U.S. Army. But the transition from combat operations to humanitarian action was not smooth. American commanders had to determine who these women were, where they came from, and what support they required, often with incomplete information and in the middle of fluid, continuing military operations. And it was within this fragile intersection of liberation and instability that the next stage emerged: the effort to stabilize newly freed territories and manage the overwhelming tide of displaced women who needed help to rebuild both their safety and their identity. In the weeks following the breakout from Normandy, the map of France shifted almost daily. Entire regions liberated overnight found themselves without functioning institutions. Mayors had fled or been arrested during the occupation. Police forces had been disbanded, infiltrated, or compromised. Communication lines were shattered by airstrikes. Bridges lay in rivers. Railways were severed. And in the middle of this disordered landscape, tens of thousands of displaced civilians, among them recently freed French women POW, needed medical treatment, documentation, shelter, and a path home. Civil affairs units had been attached to several U.S. divisions, but they were small and frequently overextended. Their mission was simple in concept yet immense in practice: restore basic order behind the front, identify critical needs, and prevent civilian crises from obstructing military operations. These officers now found themselves stepping into towns scarred by occupation, negotiating with local resistance groups, and trying to account for prisoners who emerged with no identity papers, no family contacts, and no clear record of why they had been detained. The U.S. Army's humanitarian responsibilities grew rapidly. As frontline regiments pushed east toward the Seine and the Moselle, rear areas filled with those left behind, women weakened by illness, mothers separated from children, laborers discharged from German work crews, and political detainees who had not seen freedom since 1942 or 1943. What made their situation particularly complex was the absence of uniformity. No two liberation sites were the same. At some locations, German forces had maintained order until the final hours, leaving records and rations behind. Elsewhere, they had vanished abruptly, leaving confusion and fear in their wake. To manage this, U.S. commands established temporary collection points in churches, schools, barns, and former German headquarters. These makeshift centers served as triage stations where newly freed women underwent medical checks, received rations, and were questioned about their origins. The goal was not interrogation in the security sense, but rather reconstruction of basic identity: names, birthplaces, family members, last known locations. Many women had been moved repeatedly during the occupation, transferred from one holding site to another, and were unsure where relatives might be or whether their homes still existed. Medical teams faced immediate challenges. Starvation and dehydration were common, but so were infections caused by unsanitary detention conditions. Some women had spent months in forced labor details repairing roads or working on farms requisitioned for German supply lines. Others had endured overcrowded cells, punitive isolation, or harsh interrogations. Field hospitals that had been designed primarily for combat casualties now absorbed civilians who required longer-term recovery than military planning originally allowed. American units also had to ensure that liberated women were protected from renewed danger. France in mid-1944 was not yet fully secure. German stragglers still moved through forests. Snipers lingered in church towers. Retreating forces occasionally returned to destroy infrastructure or retaliate against civilians. For many women, the first days of freedom were spent under the guarded supervision of GIs who understood that liberation did not guarantee safety. U.S. logistics officers arranged transportation networks to return displaced women to nearby towns or to direct them toward regional collection centers managed jointly with French authorities. In areas like Normandy, Brittany, and the Loire Valley, truck convoys moved daily, ferrying the freed from temporary camps to safer municipal hubs. There, French social workers, some emerging from clandestine wartime roles, attempted to rebuild welfare services almost from nothing. Yet the needs often surpassed the available resources. Entire communities had been wrecked by years of occupation, shortages, and reprisals. In many towns, there were no functioning bakeries, no operating pharmacies, no intact schools. Women who had survived captivity returned to find their homes ransacked or destroyed, their possessions stolen, and in some cases, their loved ones missing. American forces provided emergency supplies, but long-term recovery depended on structures that France was only beginning to reassemble. Despite the strain, a pattern slowly emerged. The more U.S. troops encountered groups of liberated female prisoners, the more efficiently they organized their responses. Medical corpsmen developed routines for assessing malnutrition. Quartermasters prepared standardized ration kits for displaced civilians. Civil affairs officers created registries to reconnect women with families or locate missing relatives through local administrations. What began as improvised field decisions gradually evolved into a system. And within that system, built out of urgency, compassion, and necessity, emerged the core human story of this period. How ordinary American GIs, often untrained in humanitarian work, stepped into roles that would shape the recovery and dignity of women who had endured the worst years of occupation. That human dimension forms the first of several angles through which this history must be understood. No statistic captures what it meant for a woman in occupied France to lose her freedom. For many, arrest came without explanation. A knock at the door before dawn. A search carried out in silence. A hurried march to a truck whose destination was never disclosed. By the time American soldiers arrived in 1944, these women had endured months, sometimes years, of uncertainty that left deep emotional scars. Liberation did not immediately erase the weight they carried. Many walked out of their confinement physically intact yet psychologically unsteady. They stepped back into daylight with a cautiousness shaped by survival, torn between disbelief and hope. When GIs approached them offering medical attention, blankets, or rations, the gestures often triggered tears or suspicion. It took time to understand that the uniforms now standing before them brought something the uniforms before had withheld: safety, not fear. For the women, the first days after liberation were a delicate balance between relief and vulnerability. They needed food, rest, and medical treatment, but just as urgently, they needed assurance that their identities mattered again. A name written on a clipboard, a brief conversation with a medic, or the simple act of being asked where they came from helped restore the sense of personhood captivity had eroded. In those early moments of freedom, human contact, gentle, patient, and respectful, became the foundation upon which recovery would slowly be built. And that foundation shaped how American soldiers themselves experienced the encounter. Most American troops entering France in the summer of 1944 expected a combat mission defined by enemy positions, fortified villages, and long marches. They trained for battles, not for humanitarian relief. Yet within days of crossing the beaches of Normandy, many were thrust into responsibilities far outside their preparation. For a 19-year-old infantryman, meeting a group of exhausted French women who had spent months in captivity was often a moment of disorientation. The enemy was supposed to be armed and uniformed. The victims of war often seemed distant, abstract. But here they stood, thin, frightened, dressed in patched clothing, some too weak to walk without assistance. These encounters forced GIs to confront the human consequences of the conflict in ways combat training never addressed. Letters home from soldiers occasionally mentioned these scenes. The tone was often subdued, reflective. Some wrote about handing out their own rations, unsure if it violated regulations but unable to ignore obvious hunger. Others described the difficulty of gaining the trust of women who had endured German interrogations and feared any uniform. A simple act, offering water, providing a seat on a jeep, sharing chocolate, took on a significance the soldier only realized later. In these interactions, the war became personal. It was no longer just a struggle for territory or strategy, but a confrontation with the injuries inflicted on ordinary lives. Many GIs later said that these humanitarian moments shaped their memory of France just as much as the battles they fought. And to sustain this support, the U.S. Army had to rely on another essential angle, the medical response that stabilized the most vulnerable. Behind every advancing regiment trailed a network of medics, surgeons, and field hospital staff whose job was to treat wounded soldiers. Their equipment was standardized, their routines practiced, and their priorities clear. But encountering liberated civilians, especially women emerging from detention, required rapid adaptation. Medical teams quickly learned to differentiate between conditions caused by captivity and those caused by battlefield exposure. Malnutrition demanded careful refeeding, not immediate heavy meals. Infections needed antibiotics that were already in short supply. Exhaustion required rest in spaces usually reserved for the lightly wounded. Field hospitals, originally designed to move as the front advanced, had to slow down to accommodate civilians who could not be left behind. Some women arrived with untreated fractures. Others suffered from respiratory illnesses worsened by confinement. Psychological distress, though less understood at the time, manifested in trembling hands, silence, or heightened startle responses. Medics, trained in physical trauma, did what they could, clean wounds, provide warmth, ensure hydration, but also offered something far less clinical, presence. A calm voice, a steady hand, a promise that no more harm would come. These medical efforts formed the first structured layer of support, turning improvised acts of compassion into coordinated care. And that shift opens the door to deeper layers of recovery, social, psychological, and moral, waiting in the next set of angles. Captivity reshapes a person long after the physical restraints are removed. For many French women detained under German occupation, liberation marked the beginning, not the end, of their psychological struggle. Months of uncertainty had taught them to be cautious with every word, every decision, every gesture. Stepping into freedom felt strangely exposed, as if the world had grown too wide too quickly. U.S. forces, though not trained as psychological specialists, became the first to help these women reconnect with a sense of self. A GI asking a woman her name and writing it carefully in a ledger was more than paperwork. It re-established identity. A civil affairs officer asking where she hoped to go reminded her she had a future. Even small routines, like standing in an orderly line for rations or receiving clean clothing, offered stability in place of the unpredictability she had endured. Yet recovery was not immediate. Many women wrestled with feelings of guilt for having survived when others had not. Some feared returning home, uncertain how their communities would perceive them after captivity. Others had lost family members and now confronted freedom without a familiar anchor to return to. The psychological landscape was uneven and fragile, illuminated only gradually by the safety offered in American-controlled zones. Over time, what mattered most were the predictable rhythms established by the soldiers: meals at the same hour, medical checks, regular transport convoys. These rhythms carved new foundations where steady ground had been missing. And as identity slowly resurfaced, another angle emerged: how communities rebuilt themselves around these returning women. War fractures societies as surely as it destroys buildings. When French towns were liberated, the absence of functioning institutions meant that recovery depended heavily on improvisation. The return of women who had been prisoners added a complex layer to this effort. Some came back to communities that welcomed them with relief. Others found suspicion or silence, especially where collaboration, resistance, and occupation had entangled loyalties. American forces recognized that individual recovery was tied to social recovery. Civil affairs teams often worked side by side with local volunteers, police officers reappointed overnight, and clergy who resumed leadership roles the moment German forces withdrew. Together, they created community centers where food was distributed, documents issued, and messages posted for missing family members. In several towns, women who had been detained took part in the rebuilding themselves. They helped organize ration lines, assisted in translating for American units, or supported elderly neighbors who had survived the occupation alone. These contributions strengthened their standing within the community and provided a sense of purpose that captivity had stripped away. Transportation networks set up by the U.S. Army helped reconnect villages that had been isolated for months. Relief convoys carried not only supplies but also news: who had survived, which towns had reopened schools, which areas were safe to travel. For the women, these community links were essential. Rebuilding a life was easier when the town around them was rebuilding too. Yet even with growing social stability, a deeper question emerged. What was the moral significance of American involvement in these lives that had been caught in the crossfire of occupation? Combat operations demanded speed, clarity, and overwhelming force. Humanitarian work demanded patience, empathy, and time, three things an army often lacked. And yet, in France during the second half of 1944, these contrasting imperatives lived side by side. American commanders understood that the liberation of civilians, especially women who had been prisoners, created an obligation that could not be ignored. Morally, the act of helping was simple. These were victims of an enemy system, and their suffering was undeniable. But the moral impact went further. Each act of support, from the GI offering a spare jacket to a medic treating an untreated wound, became a quiet rejection of the brutality that had defined the occupation. In offering protection and dignity, U.S. forces illustrated what distinguished liberators from conquerors. The moral weight of these actions was not lost on the civilians. For many French women, the first sign that captivity was truly over was not the lowering of a German flag, but the calm presence of a young American soldier walking them to safety. Trust rebuilt itself through such moments, small, uncelebrated, yet deeply transformative. This moral dimension helped solidify cooperation between American forces and French civilians, which in turn strengthened stability in newly liberated areas. As front lines surged toward Germany, the rear areas slowly became zones of healing rather than fear. And within that fragile balance, between war moving forward and recovery unfolding behind it, came a decisive moment when humanitarian action shifted from improvised gestures to an organized mission, marking the turning point of this story. By late autumn 1944, the rapid liberation of France had slowed. The German army, though pushed back across the Moselle and into the Vosges, continued to resist with renewed determination. The U.S. Third Army under General George S. Patton had advanced far, but supply lines were stretched and winter approached. Along the front, snow settled into the forests, dampening the sound of distant artillery. Behind those lines, however, another battle was unfolding, one not listed in operations reports but equally urgent. In the weeks following the liberation of towns across Alsace and Lorraine, U.S. soldiers encountered a concentration of displaced French women far larger than anything seen in Normandy or Brittany. Many had been seized during German crackdowns in late 1943 and early 1944, then relocated repeatedly as German units withdrew. Columns of forced labourers had been broken apart by air attacks, bad weather, or panic. Small groups had wandered into American positions with no sense of where they were. Others had been discovered in remote work camps abandoned during the German retreat toward the Vosges passes. What transformed this moment into a turning point was not only the number of women needing help but the realization that the ad hoc methods used in earlier months were no longer sufficient. In several towns, Epinal, Luneville, Sarrebourg, and dozens of surrounding villages, schools and administrative buildings were overcrowded with civilians. Field kitchens were overwhelmed. Medical tents, already tending frostbite and trench foot cases among GIs, were now treating civilians with chronic illnesses, infections, and exhaustion. Winter made everything harsher, food spoiled faster, fuel was limited, and those who slept without proper shelter risked not surviving the night. American commanders recognized that unless relief efforts were restructured, civilian suffering could escalate into catastrophe. The solution required coordination, across divisions, across services, and with the re-emerging French authorities. What emerged in November 1944 was a shift from reactive humanitarian aid to an organized civilian recovery program integrated into the broader Allied campaign. The catalyst came during the liberation of St. Didas-Vosges, a town heavily damaged by German forces during their withdrawal. As U.S. infantry secured the outskirts, they discovered a group of nearly 60 French women who had been held in a requisition factory. Their condition alarmed both medics and officers. Some could barely stand. Many showed signs of prolonged malnutrition. A handful carried fragments of documents indicating they had been detained for political reasons. Others had no papers at all. The local command reported the discovery up the chain, triggering an urgent review of how such groups were to be handled. Within 48 hours, civil affairs officers, medical detachments, and logistics teams were brought together under a unified plan. This marked the first time in eastern France that a structured framework was established specifically for supporting liberated women who had been prisoners or forced labourers. The plan included several key components. French women were no longer processed informally at scattered field posts. Instead, registration centers were set up in larger towns where U.S. units had secured administrative buildings. Names, birth dates, and last known residences were recorded. The purpose was not surveillance but restoration, reconnecting identity with documentation after months of displacement. Convoys were assigned to move liberated civilians safely from the front towards stable areas farther west. Trucks that normally returned empty from supply deliveries were now tasked with relocating women to facilities where medical care, food, and shelter were available. Field hospitals designated specific wards for civilians. This prevented overcrowding in emergency rooms and ensured that both soldiers and liberated women received necessary attention without overloading facilities. Nurses from the Army Nurse Corps played a central role, adapting their wartime routines to long-term care. Local officials, some newly returned from hiding or imprisonment, worked with American forces to begin rebuilding municipal services. This cooperation created a more stable environment for returning women, reducing reliance on temporary military aid. These measures, initiated in the Vosges, soon spread across the sector. They transformed what had been an improvised response into a deliberate system capable of addressing the scale of civilian liberation. For many GIs, this shift marked a visible change. What had once been isolated encounters with small groups of exhausted women became organized efforts with clear objectives. Trucks arrived on schedule. Doctors moved through wards with structured lists. French volunteers prepared clothing and blankets supplied by American depots. There was still hardship, there always was, but now there was also direction. Within days, U.S. units began to notice the impact. Women who had arrived unable to walk unaided were standing again. Some, after regaining strength, began helping with translation or assisting others who remained weak. The atmosphere in the makeshift centers shifted from crisis management to recovery. Voices grew louder. Faces softened. The sense of fear that had clung to the newly liberated began to fade. This moment, when relief stopped being improvised and became intentional, marked the turning point in the effort to help French women POW rebuild their lives. It was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. No single battle defined it. But in the quiet rooms of converted schools, in the organized lines for food and care, and in the steady rhythm of transport convoys, a decisive threshold had been crossed. And as winter deepened and the front moved ever closer to Germany, this new system would be tested further, shaping the next and more intense phase of humanitarian action. As 1944 gave way to the harsh winter of early 1945, the front surged eastward again. Armored divisions carved narrow paths through snow-covered valleys. Infantry units pushed toward the German border under constant threat of counterattack. The Battle of the Bulge raged farther north, drawing reinforcements and stretching Allied attention. Yet even as the war's violence intensified along the front, the system created in eastern France continued to function behind it, quietly, steadily, and with growing sophistication. The turning point had been the organization of a structured relief framework. Now the test was scale. In the weeks that followed, U.S. forces liberated dozens of additional sites where French women had been held. Some locations were small, such as the outbuildings near Breyers or isolated labor farms outside Baccarat. Others, like the complex of requisition facilities near Colmar, held larger groups under far harsher conditions. Each new discovery strained resources but also confirmed that the new system was essential. Transportation became the backbone of the operation. Every day, long columns of trucks left forward supply dumps loaded with fuel, ammunition, and rations for frontline troops. On their return journeys, instead of running empty, they carried liberated civilians, women first, followed by elderly men and children when space allowed. The drivers wrote later that these return trips felt different from the normal rhythm of the war. The roads were the same, the watchful scanning for German patrols remained, but the presence of women wrapped in blankets, heads leaning against the canvas sides, changed the purpose of each journey. The war was still raging, yet the trucks moving west carried something resembling hope. At designated centers, Epinal, Nancy, Wiesel, and smaller towns in between, American and French personnel worked side by side. The registration teams had grown more efficient. Lists were updated daily, photographs taken when possible, and missing persons requests recorded in ledgers that grew heavier by the week. For many women, learning that relatives were alive became the first glimpse of normal life returning. For others, confirmation of loss came in the same room where they had regained their freedom. Both moments, though opposite in emotional weight, were part of the same fragile process of rebuilding identity in a world reshaped by war. Medical care deepened as well. Army Nurse Corps personnel, often working in converted schoolrooms with thin walls and unreliable heating, developed treatment routines suited for long-term civilian recovery. They taught women how to manage lingering illnesses, provided clean clothing, and monitored nutrition carefully. When supplies arrived late or not at all, a common occurrence in winter, nurses often shared their own rations or blankets. The boundary between soldier and civilian blurred in these moments, unified by necessity and compassion. In several instances, the women themselves became part of the recovery infrastructure. Those strong enough began assisting with translation, childcare, or distributing supplies. Others helped identify additional former prisoners wandering through forests or emerging from hiding. Their knowledge of local terrain and occupation patterns allowed civil affairs teams to locate more survivors than they could have alone. The process of rebuilding thus became collaborative. American resources, French resilience, and the shared understanding that time was limited before the war's next phase demanded attention. This urgency was felt most intensely in January 1945. As Allied forces prepared for the final push toward the Rhine, they needed stable rear areas free from humanitarian crises that could drain resources. At the same time, freed women needed assurance that their recovery would not be abandoned as the army moved east. Balancing both needs required careful coordination. In some towns, the handover to French authorities came quickly. In others, the transition was slower, marked by shortages, delayed supplies, and the inevitable complications of building administrative structures from scratch. Yet despite these difficulties, one fact became clear: the organized effort was working. Civilians were no longer scattered behind the front, vulnerable to cold, hunger, and isolation. They were visible, accounted for, treated, sheltered, and increasingly ready to return home. The war had created a vast landscape of destruction, but in the quiet corners of eastern France, another landscape, one of repair, had taken shape. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, the moment of American involvement began to contract. By February 1945, Allied lines were advancing rapidly toward Germany. New priorities emerged: crossing the Rhine, securing supply routes, preparing for final offensives. As the front moved eastward, the rear areas stabilized. French authorities regained control of civil administration. Relief centers gradually closed or were handed over to national services. For the U.S. soldiers who had spent weeks caring for liberated women, the transition was bittersweet. Many left without knowing what became of the people they had helped. Others watched from truck convoys as familiar towns receded into the distance, replaced by new roads leading toward the next phase of the war. Their humanitarian work had not been planned, but it had become one of the quiet achievements of the campaign. In those final days before American units shifted fully toward the German frontier, the last transport convoys rolled westward, carrying women who were no longer prisoners, no longer uprooted figures in a war-torn landscape, but individuals beginning to reclaim their lives. And once the dust settled and the towns grew still again, the consequences of these weeks of intense humanitarian action would reveal themselves in ways that shaped the months and years to come. By early spring 1945, the war in France had shifted decisively eastward. The front had crossed the Rhine, and the last German strongholds in Lorraine, Alsace, and eastern France were under Allied control. Behind those advancing lines, towns and villages settled into a tentative calm. Buildings stood damaged but repairable. Streets that had carried retreating German troops now echoed with the voices of civilians returning to daily life. And at the heart of this reconstruction were the French women who had once been prisoners. The numbers were sobering. Across the regions of eastern France, American civil affairs and medical reports estimated that thousands of women had been detained in camps, work details, and ad hoc holding sites during the occupation. Of these, a significant proportion, perhaps 20 to 30%, arrived in liberated areas in need of immediate medical care. Malnutrition, untreated illness, and psychological distress were widespread. Yet by March 1945, most of these women had passed through U.S. organized recovery centers, received medical attention, and were either returned home or placed in semi-permanent shelters while families were located. Medical officers documented remarkable improvements. Women who arrived at collection centers too weak to stand were walking, eating, and interacting within weeks. Field nurses noted changes not only in physical health but in demeanor. The quiet wariness of the first days gave way to cautious curiosity, then smiles. Letters from American soldiers to their families sometimes mentioned the contrast between the fear etched on faces upon liberation and the resilience displayed a month later. It was the slow restoration of normalcy that defined this period. Communities themselves began to stabilize. Towns organized local councils to coordinate food distribution, rebuild infrastructure, and reopen schools. Former prisoners, once isolated, now became participants in the recovery process. They assisted with ration lines, helped care for younger children whose parents had been displaced or killed, and shared knowledge of surrounding areas to locate other displaced individuals. This collaboration strengthened the social fabric, and in some cases, created bonds between liberated women and the soldiers who had aided them that endured long after the front moved onward. The numbers alone, however, tell only part of the story. Official records indicate the scale of aid: thousands of blankets distributed, hundreds of medical cases treated daily, dozens of towns receiving logistical support from U.S. convoys. But behind these statistics were the intimate, human moments. The first hot meal after months of starvation, the small gift of soap or clothing, the nervous laughter when a soldier shared chocolate. Each act, while operationally minor, contributed to a collective sense of safety and recovery. The U.S. Army's civil affairs reports reflected this duality. One officer wrote in January 1945, "We came expecting to liberate towns, not heal souls. Yet in caring for these women, we learned a different kind of mission, one that required patience, judgment, and compassion as much as bullets and trucks." These words encapsulated the moral and practical achievements of the months following liberation, a war fought on the front lines, and a parallel effort quietly unfolding in the shadows. Even as new offensives loomed toward Germany, the impact of these actions continued to resonate. Local authorities, previously paralyzed by occupation, began documenting citizens systematically. Records created in American-led centers allowed families to reconnect, legal documents to be restored, and property claims to be processed. The liberated women, once invisible in the chaos of retreat and advance, were now accounted for in ways that ensured long-term stability. And yet, while the immediate crisis had been addressed, the human consequences of captivity, the trauma, the lost time, the absence of family, remained. It was a relief that had been hard-won, but it was only the first stage in a much longer journey toward rebuilding not just towns, but lives. As spring advanced into early summer 1945, liberated French towns took their first tentative steps toward normalcy. Streets were swept, markets reopened, and churches rang bells for the first time in years. Women who had been prisoners returned home, or discovered new paths where home no longer existed. In many cases, the wartime displacement had permanently altered families and communities. Widows, orphans, and those who had lost siblings or parents now faced a fragile landscape, yet one no longer dominated by immediate danger. The numbers reveal the scale of recovery. Across eastern France, records compiled by civil affairs and local authorities estimate that upwards of 15,000 to 20,000 women had been liberated from camps, forced labor detachments, or remote holding locations between August 1944 and March 1945. Nearly all had received medical treatment, warm clothing, and food rations. Many had been relocated temporarily to larger towns to facilitate reunification with surviving relatives. While some returned to their original homes, others resettled in nearby cities where housing and infrastructure were more intact. The psychological impact of this recovery period was profound. Women who had endured months or years of captivity began regaining confidence and autonomy. Community programs, often supported by American aid, offered literacy classes, childcare, and vocational training. Local volunteers, sometimes fellow former detainees, worked alongside returning women to rebuild schools, farms, and small businesses. The sense of purpose restored through these efforts provided a foundation for resilience. Survivor testimonies later emphasized how participation in communal rebuilding, however small, helped to mitigate the lingering effects of trauma. Politically and socially, these events also left lasting consequences. The presence of U.S. troops in civilian relief roles fostered trust between liberated populations and the Allies. Many French women came to view Americans not merely as soldiers but as protectors and allies who had intervened when local structures failed. Early post-war Franco-American relations, including joint relief projects and humanitarian initiatives, can trace part of their roots to these moments of immediate post-liberation aid. Yet not all outcomes were positive or straightforward. Some families had disappeared entirely, leaving women without any connection to pre-war communities. Others faced lingering social stigma due to misunderstandings about their captivity. Even with the most organized aid, the psychological scars of imprisonment did not vanish. Medical and relief reports noted cases of long-term illness, malnutrition, and depression, highlighting the limits of even the most thorough intervention in the midst of ongoing conflict. Nevertheless, the intervention of U.S. forces created conditions in which recovery was possible. Soldiers, medics, and civil affairs teams had established a system that combined immediate relief with structured rehabilitation, forming a template that would influence subsequent humanitarian efforts in Europe. Their actions demonstrated that even amid the chaos of war, organized and compassionate intervention could profoundly change individual lives, and, by extension, entire communities. By summer 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Germany had surrendered, and attention shifted from liberation to reconstruction. Formerly imprisoned women now joined the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding France itself, returning to work, restoring homes, and reclaiming social roles once suspended by the occupation. The quiet victories of survival and restoration, aided by American soldiers, were hidden from the headlines of military campaigns, yet they represented one of the most profound triumphs in the human dimension of the war. As the immediate crisis passed and towns stabilized, a reflective lens emerges, one that considers what these events meant for history, for humanity, and for the subtle forms of heroism that often go unrecorded in the pages of strategy and battle. War leaves scars in places maps cannot measure. It reshapes landscapes, societies, and most profoundly, the lives of those who survive its darkest moments. The liberation of French women prisoners by U.S. forces in 1944–45 offers a window into this subtle yet monumental truth. Beyond battles and territorial gains, the quiet work of restoring dignity, identity, and hope was as essential to victory as any captured town or bridge. For the women who emerged from detention, the immediate relief, warm blankets, rations, medical care, was only the first step. Even more transformative was the recognition of their humanity, the simple acts that restored agency after months of deprivation. Each ledger entry, each measured ration, each patient conversation became a lifeline, connecting them once again to the social fabric from which they had been severed. Through these acts, soldiers and medics not only preserved life but also sowed the seeds of trust, resilience, and communal restoration. For the American soldiers, the experience redefined their understanding of service. They were trained to fight, but in these moments, they became caretakers, mediators, and witnesses. The war, in its chaos, demanded compassion as much as courage. And in providing that, they left a mark invisible to strategy charts but indelible in human memory. These months of recovery, though fleeting in the grand scope of the war, carried lessons that resonated far beyond eastern France. They demonstrated the power of organized humanitarian intervention, the importance of collaboration between liberators and local communities, and the quiet heroism found in empathy amidst destruction. They remind us that the aftermath of liberation, when the guns have fallen silent, is as pivotal to history as the battles themselves. Ultimately, the story of these women is one of resilience. It is a testament to the capacity of human beings to rebuild when given safety, support, and dignity. And it stands as a reminder that even amid the vast machinery of war, Small, deliberate acts of care can create ripples that endure far longer than the echo of gunfire.